Hello, my name's Cris Putnam. It's my pleasure to present to you on astrobiology and the Vatican ET connection. Now, I have a Bachelor of Science degree in mathematics, and I also have a master's degree in theology. But I've also had a long-running interest in the UFO phenomenon, at least back into the early 70s. In fact, I still have a scrapbook of UFO newspaper articles beginning with the Pascagoula, Mississippi case in 1973. So this unconventional range of interest kind of came to fruition in this book. This is the book I co-authored with Thomas Horn, EXO-VATICANA. And you might notice the subtitle, The Vatican's Astonishing Plan for the Arrival of an Alien Savior. Now, I suspect that sounds pretty sensational to many of you. So I'm going to unpack throughout the course of this presentation, what we mean by that. And I'm sure many of you are curious about the book's cover. Perhaps you're wondering if that's just creative license. But actually, something very much like the cover of the book was documented by the Mutual UFO Network and even the New York Times. Now, for Roman Catholics, the year 1978 will long be remembered as the year of three popes. Pope Paul VI died on August 6, 1978. Then Pope John Paul I was elected, but only lived 63 days. And many claim he was actually murdered. Then in October, John Paul II was elected and became the famous pope that many of us probably remember. But what you might not know is that this spiritually charged period of time also marked an unprecedented level of UFO activity over Rome. Within the midst of the doomed pontificate of John Paul I's brief reign, numerous cigar, disc, and triangular-shaped craft were seen haunting the skies across Italy by people of all walks of life, including Vatican officials. Now, according to the Mutual UFO Network, at 5:50 a.m. on September 14th, people in Rome saw a triangular object for 5 minutes. At about the same time, people near Florence reported seeing a cigar-shaped object. Early on the morning of the 16th, highway police near Rome received calls about a luminous triangle and a beam of greenish light. Now, the early morning triangular craft sighting on September 14th in Rome was reported by police, Vatican guards, and airline workers. Now, the purpose and effect of the green light is still unknown, but 2 fishermen actually went missing, and I can't find any record of them ever being found. Now, as the third pope within the calendar year took office, UFOs grew more invasive, so much so that the story made the New York Times. Now, the slide that you're looking at is a clipping from the New York Times news service in December of 1978. Dozens of persons witnessed and photographed a strange donut-shaped craft emitting a beam of green light above Rome on December 14, 1978. Now, according to the article, Rome's police department corroborated the UFO sighting, and more disturbing, these 2 fishermen from a nearby village disappeared and their fate is unknown. The unprecedented level of UFO activity over Rome, coinciding with the infamous year of 3 popes, at a minimum suggests that there's something really interesting going on. Many in ufology have noticed that the Vatican has an uncanny interest in the UFO phenomenon and extraterrestrial life. Now, in 2012, the book After Disclosure, When the Government Finally Reveals the Truth About Alien Contact, Richard Dolan and Bruce Zabel wrote concerning Roman Catholicism. The world's largest church seems to be positioning itself at the forefront of disclosure. The Vatican has long maintained several major astronomical observatories and a collection of radio telescopes. In recent years, its hierarchy has stated, in one form or another, that we have company. Perhaps they know something is afoot or suspect its inevitability, end quote. So there is a wealth of evidence suggesting this conclusion that these 2 UFO researchers came to. Now, do they know something we do not know? Well, we're looking at the oldest bureaucracy in history. It has 1,214 million followers. Within that, we have highly placed worldwide insiders, secret societies, including the Jesuits, Knights of Columbus, Knights of Malta, Opus Dei. Now, on top of all this global infrastructure, they do maintain a state-of-the-art observatory, which we'll get to later. Of course, it's widely known that Roman Catholicism conducts investigations of the supernatural and anomalous phenomena, miracles, apparitions, and it even interacts with non-human intelligences via exorcism. But Roman Catholicism is also famously associated with many unidentified aerial phenomenon, abbreviated UAP. The miracle of the sun was an unidentified aerial phenomenon witnessed on October 13, 1917, by up to 100,000 people gathered near Fatima, Portugal. Here's a 1917 newspaper with a photo of the crowd looking up at the sky. Now here's another photo of a large crowd gathered at Fatima. Several newspaper reporters in attendance recorded the testimony from people who claimed to have witnessed an extraordinary aerial phenomenon in which a silvery disk flew about in the sky. Now, of course, this was long before the term flying saucer was coined, and many thought the disk was the sun. Also, because it had been raining and the clouds had just broken out as the phenomenon occurred, many believed it was a solar miracle. However, if the sun had actually moved in the described manner, the gravitational effects would have devastated the Earth. Even so, the sighting was officially declared a miracle by the Roman Catholic Church in 1930. Now, here's some descriptions from various eyewitnesses, accounts recording in a book called Heavenly Lights, The Apparitions of Fatima and the UFO Phenomenon by Joaquim Fernandez. Now, here's a quote from a religious periodical. It says, "Suddenly a luminous disk, the size of a great host, but one which could be gazed upon as one gazes at the moon, appeared, as if it stood out from the sun, descending visibly." Here's Mario Gahino, an engineer, described it as a disk of polished glass illuminated from behind. And he used terms like a majestic disk. Again, Gilbert dos Santos, the sun is described as a dull silver disk. Maria Romana, the sun gave the appearance of a globe of dull silver fire surrounded by a very dark purplish disk. Now, more eyewitness reports could be cited, but I think the point has been made. The official version of the story was packaged in the religious terminology, specifically Catholic dogma, of the day. However, based on multiple descriptions of a silver disk and a sun that did not have the blinding qualities of the sun, it appears that the eyewitness accounts above that people were looking at was a craft of some sort. I believe that if you or I were to somehow transport ourselves back to 1917 in Fatima, Portugal, we'd point to the sky and say, "Look at that, a UFO." Now here's the only known photograph of the alleged miracle of the sun. Now what I've done is I've zoomed in on this dark disk that's in the sky so you can sort of get an idea of what we're looking at. Here's a cropped up close-up of the disk, or perhaps a globe. Now I don't think this is a picture of the sun. The sun is a blinding fireball, not a dull gray globe. So why is the sun supposedly dark gray in this black and white photo? Obviously, we're not looking at the sun. Now, many scholars are now categorizing Fatima as a mass UFO sighting. A Portuguese university history professor, Joaquim Fernandez, assembled an international panel to subject the Fatima apparitions to the scrutiny of modern scientific analysis. In his book, Fatima Revisited, 2008, Jacques Vallée and Eric Davis discussed the psycho-spiritual nature of the UFO phenomenon and assert Fatima as a representative case. As one example among many, it will be recalled that the events at Fatima involved luminous phenomena, atmospheric and thermal effects, and descriptions of an apparently metallic disk in the sky, while many of the 70,000 witnesses also experienced spiritual and psychological effects. Now, interestingly, as we go back to this outline, do they know something we don't know? We've already seen, they had this huge miracle at Fatima, Portugal, involving a gray disk in the sky, something that's become really just a trademark of modern Roman Catholic prophetic interest. Now, Pope Pius XII, who was the famous pope during World War II, actually witnessed this same phenomenon over the Vatican gardens in Rome 33 years later in 1950. A note signed by Pope Pius XII states that on October 31st, 1950, the sun, which was quite high and looked like a pale opaque sphere entirely surrounded by a luminous circle, end quote. Now, the disc-shaped object that he mentions, quote, moved outward slightly, either spinning or moving from left to right and vice versa. But within the sphere, you could see marked movements with total clarity and without interruption, end quote. Now, this is the sort of unidentified aerial phenomenon associated with Mary. However, that's quite astonishing because it really doesn't seem to have any connection to Mary within itself. But this is the Pope who actually approved the Fatima apparitions in 1940. And then he consecrated the entire world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary 2 years later. Now, more provocative is that he saw this spinning spherical anomaly on the day he defined the dogma of the Assumption of Mary, the Catholic belief that Mary ascended bodily into heaven. So quite literally, we can make a case that official Catholic dogma was dictated to him by a UFO. Back to our outline. Do they know something we don't know? Well, we've seen that they've seen a miracle of the sun that seems to be a UFO sighting. Pope Pius XII sees this opaque sphere over Rome. And now we get to the Vatican Observatory Research Group, acronym VORG. Now, it's not at all controversial to say that the Vatican is looking for ET. In 2009, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences hosted an astrobiology study week on the Vatican grounds from November 6th to the 11th. Now, the Pope's Academy gathered over 30 astronomers, biologists, geologists, as well as Catholic theologians to discuss the existence of extraterrestrials and the theological implications of disclosure. Welcoming perspectives from atheists, New Agers, Buddhists, and Catholics alike, the conference primarily focused on the scientific disciplines investigating the existence of extraterrestrial life and making contact.
For the Church, talking about life on other planets is not an everyday occurrence. But that was the theme at a week-long meeting that gathered scientists and theologians in the Vatican. The purpose of the meeting centered around astrobiology and the possibility that life exists elsewhere in the universe.
In this week, we've had a possibility to interact with our colleagues and try to answer questions like, will we find life in our solar system through space exploration or big telescopes, and will we get signs of biosignatures of life in the extrasolar planets that we have 400 of them out there today.
These planets have an atmosphere that can be similar to the atmosphere on Earth and have what we call biomarkers. So those elements that help to the development of life.
Scientists believe that by comparing our own planet's atmosphere to those of planets outside our solar system, they can get closer to understanding the possibility of life on other planets. The participants agreed that science and faith are not incompatible, and that both sides should continue working together in approaching this relatively new scientific field.
This dialogue and the scientists bringing that information from their research is occurring in the Pope's home. It's occurring in the heart of the Catholic Church. That is a receptivity to the information that is really the most important thing.
Professor Cris Putnam from the University of Arizona was among the scientists involved in the week-long meeting and said that bringing together different perspectives contributes to a positive dialogue on astrobiology.
What was most important was it's still rare to have scientists from so many different perspectives and disciplines, intensively for a week sharing their opinions. And you could see that as people were getting ready to leave the meeting, they were still digesting the views of other scientists.
Scientists have not gathered any concrete proof that life exists elsewhere other than Earth. In fact, they admit that it may take years before the first sign of life on another planet is detected. But through meetings like this one, scientists and theologians have begun an important dialogue in understanding the young study of astrobiology.
And so here we have a headline: the Vatican prepares for extraterrestrial disclosure. Dr. Michael Salla of Exopolitics movement, he's concluded from this 2009 astrobiology conference that this really indicated the Vatican was preparing us for the big event of extraterrestrial disclosure. Now, at that event, there were some things that would suggest something like that. Cosmology and astrobiology education and outreach designate Dr. Cris Putnam from the University of Arizona gave the keynote speech, stating it is plausibly estimated that there are hundreds of millions of habitable locations in the Milky Way, which is just one of billions of galaxies in the universe. As scientists gather to discuss the progress in astrobiology, we still know of only one planet with life, our own, but there is palpable expectation that the universe harbors life, and there is hope that the first discovery is only a few years away. Now, that was in 2009. So by the time you're watching this video, those few years have certainly passed us by. But there have been some really major announcements concerning exoplanets. And that's really what's driving this idea that a major discovery is only a few years away. They're finding what they call Earth-like planets. Sometimes they use the word habitable even. We'll find out that those terms are kind of exaggerated, to say the least. Well, Dr. Putnam's few years are now upon us. These exoplanet discoveries really do seem to offer some promise to what they're saying, because prior to 1995, there was no evidence for any planets whatsoever outside of our own solar system. Now, that has dramatically changed as scientists now estimate there are billions of planets. And now only maybe 1,706 such planets have been confirmed as of this week, but that's still a lot. Although the progress is remarkable, out of those, only 12 or so are classified as potentially habitable. Now, even so, that adjective habitable is really begging the question. What it actually denotes is that the planet resides in what they call the Goldilocks zone, meaning that it's not too hot and it's not too cold to hold liquid water. Now, this is crucial for the existence of life, because if a planet's too hot, the water vaporizes into gas and the atoms really cannot join together to form molecules. And of course, if it's too cold, then you only have ice and not liquid water, and there's no life-sustaining chemical reactions that can occur. So here's an artist's conception that depicts Kepler 62e, a super-Earth planet, meaning it's 1.6 times the size of the Earth, and it's in the habitable zone of a star smaller and cooler than our Sun. And so for that reason, it orbits at an equivalent distance of Mercury. But because it's cooler, it has still within the Goldilocks zone. So it orbits its host star every 122 days. So they literally have a 122-day year. Now, a modeling study done by the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics suggests that Kepler 62e would have a very hospitable climate for life, as it would be damp in a warm environment, even up to the area around its poles. However, according to this modeling study, it's probably completely covered in water. So that would make civilization difficult to achieve, at least by our own understanding. It's located about 1,200 light years from Earth in the constellation Lyra. It was found using the transit method based on the dimming effect that a planet causes as it crosses in front of its star. So I think it's really important that we understand that they're not actually observing these planets. They're not firsthand looking at the planet. All this is done by modeling and other detection methods. So let's examine some of the methods of planet detection. The transit method, which I just discussed is how they found this planet, is used to detect the planet crossing directly in front of its star. Now, because stars really only amount to small points of light, this is detected when the brightness dips by just a few %. So a small dip in luminosity indicates that something has obscured the view. And that's really how they're finding a majority of these planets. The other method is called the wobble method. Now, it's a simple way to describe the planet's gravity tugging gravitationally as it orbits. So in reality, when something orbits, the planet and star are orbiting their common center of mass. But it's a large orbiting planet causes a noticeable wobble on the star. So this creates a detectable Doppler effect that the Kepler satellite or a sensitive telescope can detect. So again, they're not directly observing a planet, they're observing the effect of it going around the star. Now here's an artist's rendition of its neighbor to 62e. This is Kepler 62f, and it's in the foreground. And that little bright thing that you see over to the right is Kepler 62e that we just discovered. Now, it's more distant than 62e, and it would need the greenhouse effect to form plenty of carbon dioxide to make it warm enough to host an ocean. Otherwise, it really might be an ice-covered snowball. But it's another candidate that they have listed as a potentially habitable planet. Now, just in the last couple weeks from when we've made this video, astronomers have made a major announcement that they have just discovered the first definitive Earth-sized planet that orbits in the habitable zone. Experts don't know if the planet actually has water or a protective atmosphere, but its size seems optimal. This is Kepler 186f. Now, what is driving these scientists to say that these planets are Earth-like or habitable? Is really more of a worldview issue, I've found, than a directly scientific conclusion. There are a lot of assumptions behind the science of astrobiology, because technically, if you think about it, we have astronomy, the study of space, and biology, the study of life. So we're talking about a science that reports to be the study of life in space. But technically, we've never found any life in space. So I find it a little interesting that you can get a PhD in a subject that absolutely has nothing at all to study as far as we know. But see, we live in a society that has elevated scientists to be the ultimate arbiters of truth. Now, this is an idea called scientism. But scientism is really a self-refuting idea. It's an idea that commits suicide because it doesn't meet its own standard for truth. Now, think about it. The idea that science is the only avenue to truth was not arrived at by the scientific method itself. Therefore, it doesn't meet its own standard, and it can't be true. So where did this all come from? Well, it kind of began back in what they call the Copernican Revolution. The Copernican Revolution displaced the Earth from the center of the cosmos. And, they discovered that the sun was the center of our solar system. But it's really led to this idea that the Earth, there's nothing special about the position of the Earth. Now, that idea led to what is called the Copernican principle, and that is that we're not even in a special place in the universe. And from there, scientists have extrapolated much further to an idea that the Earth is just a mediocre planet amongst many, probably similar life-supporting planets. And this is called the principle of mediocrity. And it's based on the idea that, if you select something from two groups of things, you have, a large group of things, and you have a small group of things, and you just pick one at random, well, the chances are that what you have came from the large group. So based on that, they argue that the Earth being a life-supported planet is likely from a larger group of life-supporting planets. But see, that's an assumption that's really not based on anything factual because they don't know that there are many life-supporting planets. They're just assuming that. It's really circular reasoning. But the principle of mediocrity is widely accepted in astronomy and in astrobiology in particular. When you add to that the assumptions of abiogenesis, the idea that life can just poof into being from non-life by random forces, and then Darwinism that evolves into increasingly complex forms of life, and then you really arrive that humans are nothing special, and from there, extraterrestrial life is just an inevitable outcome of this worldview. So these widely accepted presuppositions really contribute to the widespread belief in intelligent extraterrestrial life. Now, a lot of people will just sort of accept this worldview without really understanding all these collateral assumptions that they're adopting as they go along. You know, you might not think that just believing in aliens, you know, brings all this other baggage, but the astrobiology project really does have all these assumptions behind it, and they are worth examining because many of them are extremely tenuous. Now, here's a report from May 21st, 2014. Scientists from SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, appeared before the U.S. Congress asking for funding, and they claimed it would just be absolutely bizarre if we are alone, and asked for continued funding to detect extraterrestrial life. But are these assumptions behind that claim really sound? I would like to talk about the rare earth hypothesis. Now, life is much more likely a rare commodity than commonly assumed by these scientists. Now, in their book, Rare Earth, Why Complex Life is Uncommon in the Universe, Peter Ward, a geologist and paleontologist, and Donald Brownlee, an astronomer and astrobiologist, argue that the emergence of complex life requires a host of fortuitous circumstances not accounted for by most astrobiologists. And I think it's important to recognize that these guys are not Christians, they're not intelligent design proponents. These are hard-nosed scientists working at major university science departments, and this is just their honest appraisal of the evidence. And I think that once you understand what's involved in the Earth, in the emergence of intelligent life, these astrobiological assumptions are very simplistic. Now, point one that they make argues that much of the known universe, including large parts of our own galaxy, are called dead zones. They can't support complex life. So for a planet to host intelligent life, it has to be at the right location in the right kind of galaxy. The second point they make is the aforementioned Goldilocks zone that we already talked about, where a planet needs to be within an Earth-comparable distance from its sun, so it's not too hot, not too cold, it can have liquid water. Now, third, a life-supporting system must be structured more or less like our solar system, with a small rocky inner planets and outer gas giants. If you think about it, without massive Jupiter out there, our planet would be bombarded by asteroids and space debris. A huge gravitational force like Jupiter attracts a lot of the trash that comes into our solar system and absolutely protects us. Without that, we probably would have been wiped out thousands of years ago. Now, fourth, it really needs stable orbits. Now, you know, for life to exist, you need a stable climate, you need stable temperatures and tides and things of that nature that you can depend on. Without a stable orbit, then none of these things are possible. And our solar system reflects an optimal design. All the planets really orbit in a stable manner. Fifth, you know, a large planet's immense gravity is problematic for life. And so a small one would be not have enough gravity to hold an atmosphere in. So the Earth's size is ideal. So you really have to have a planet of a particular size. The sixth point, it speaks to our moon and how our moon is somewhat of a freak because of its large size and its comparison to the Earth. Now, the moon's gravity actually stabilizes our planet's tilt, giving us the seasons. And without the moon, the variation would be chaotic, making complex life on land impossible. Also, the moon affects the ocean tides, and without it, they would only be about half of what they are now, effectively excluding tidal pools that are rich with life. Now, finally, the moon acts also as a protective shield. And I think just one look at the moon, you see all those craters all over it. It's really been our protector. Most of the debris that comes near the Earth actually hits our moon. And you know, I think that's evident from its crater-pocked surface. 7. Now, this is one that most people would never think of, but it's probably the most important one on the list. Plate tectonics. Now, that's really a fancy term for the movement of the planetary crust across the surface of the Earth. Now, recently I was in California, and you can just see, you know, big crust of the Earth sticking up out of the ground near the San Andreas Fault. Well, you know, believe it or not, these things are necessary for intelligent life to exist. It's essential for recycling carbon. providing nutrients, and really maintaining our atmosphere. Now, the rare Earth hypothesis argues that this really could be the decisive factor. And the thing that's really interesting is we know of no other planet that has plate tectonics like the Earth. None of the ones in our solar system have anything close. So it really does seem that our planet is quite special indeed. Now, the last assumption is really abiogenesis, and evolution. And this is the idea that life comes into being from non-life. And this is truly a mystery to science. In fact, the world's most famous atheist, Richard Dawkins, wrote an essay called Climbing Mount Improbable. Now, he wrote, quote, "As far as we know, it may have happened only once on one planet out of a billion planets in the universe. Of course, many people think that it actually happened on lots of planets, but we only know, we have evidence that it happened on one planet after a lapse of 500 million to 1 billion years. So the sort of lucky event we are looking at could be so widely improbable that the chances of it happening somewhere in the universe could be as low as 1 in a billion in any one year." Interestingly, Francis Crick, the Nobel Prize-winning co-discoverer of the double helix structure of DNA, acknowledged, "An honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have to have been satisfied to get it going." So that's quite an astounding admission from two famous atheistic biologists. And this really led Crick to propose what is known as directed panspermia. So in 1973, Crick and Orgel proposed directed panspermia, and this is the idea that suggested that, quote, "Life started on Earth as a result of an infection by a microorganism sent here deliberately by a technological society on another planet by means of a special long-range unmanned spaceship," end quote. So it's important to note that Crick and Orgel really were driven to this conclusion by just the astronomical unlikeliness of abiogenesis. They really just can't come up with any way to get life started, to get the whole Darwinian project started. You have to have life. You have to have reproducing life. And because they just don't have anything really going for them to explain how life emerged, they absolutely proposed to just push it out into the universe and make an argument that perhaps aliens seeded life on Earth. Now, it might be astounding to you, but in these scientific circles, this idea is really gaining a lot of traction, especially in popular parlance. Science fiction authors and the entertainment industry have been promoting it for decades. Now, here's some films. Mission to Mars came out around the year 2000. It absolutely promoted this idea that the Martians basically seeded life on Earth, and for centuries we've been looking for the origin of life on Earth. We've been looking on the wrong planet, was the promotional spiel. So then we had Knowing in 2009, starring Nicolas Cage. In that movie, aliens not only started life on Earth, they come back and rapture selected persons right before a great cataclysm at the end. Another interesting correlation to biblical prophecy. Prometheus, that came out in 2012. At the beginning of the film, you see this alien diving into the ocean and just kind of seeding all this life. And the promotional line for the film was, "The search for our beginning could lead to our end." Boom, boom, boom. So Hollywood has really promoted the idea of panspermia. Now, really interesting again, in the movie Expelled, Oxford zoologist, outspoken atheist Richard Dawkins made an appeal to directed panspermia in the movie when he was asked about the origin of life by Ben Stein. Now, sometimes intelligent design critics will claim that, that ideas are making a God of the gaps argument by inserting God into the gaps of scientific knowledge. Well, it's quite interesting that when Dawkins was cornered on the origin of life, he proposed that perhaps aliens did it, making an aliens of the gaps argument.
Well, then how did it get created?
Well, by a very slow process.
Well, how did it start?
Nobody knows how it started. We know the kind of event that it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life.
What was that?
It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule.
Right, how did that happen?
I told you we don't know.
So you have no idea how it started?
No, nor has anybody.
Nor has anyone else. What do you think is the possibility that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or in evolution?
It could come about in the following way. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very, very high level of technology and designed a form of life that they seeded onto perhaps this planet. Now, that is a possibility and an intriguing possibility. And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe. Well, but that higher intelligence would itself have had to have come about by some explicable or ultimately explicable process. It couldn't have just jumped into existence spontaneously. That's the point.
So Professor Dawkins was not against intelligent design, just certain types of designers, such as God.
Now here's a quote from one of my mentors, Dr. Michael Heiser, who was actually the adjunct professor I had for Old Testament when I was in seminary. Now, speaking to the subject of panspermia, Heiser explains, quote, "It paves the way for a true merging of science and religion. It will be the paradigm that allows the atheist to tolerate religion and allows literalist Bible readers, the Eastern Buddhist, and the pagan to simultaneously parse the new science the same way. This might, in turn, be useful fodder for a global religion," end quote. Now, interestingly, an impetus toward globalism is one of the reasons for the UFO taboo cited by political scientists Dr. Alexander Wendt and Raymond Duval in their groundbreaking essay, Sovereignty in the UFO. This was discussed in Leslie Kean's book. Now, Dr. Heiser suspects that in the near future, scientists will announce a discovery supporting panspermia that will quickly be extrapolated by the public into belief in extraterrestrials. Now, when considered in the light of the present public acceptance of ancient astronaut theory and things like that, this ripple effect could eliminate, quote, "any discernible obstacle to articulating a global religion that honors the cosmologies of all faiths." Now, a Catholic priest and astronomer, Kenneth J. Delano, wrote, quote, "Our religious sensitivities ought not be shocked by the idea that the evolutionary history of the human body might be traced back ultimately to a primordial refuse heap left by visiting extraterrestrial intelligence when the Earth was young," end quote. In other words, we might have evolved from alien garbage. Now, the thing that makes this book really interesting to me is that it has the official stamps of approval from the Roman Catholic Church. Now, this was by a designated censor in the diocese that Delano was from, and then it has an imprimatur, which is the final approval of an official declaration by the bishop of that diocese that the work is published indicating the content is free from any errors concerning Catholic doctrine. So they are absolutely wide open and proving of the idea that humans evolved from alien refuse. Now, just a month or so ago from the filming of this, in the 21st of March, in March of 2014, the Vatican Observatory co-hosted yet another astrobiology conference, this time in the United States at the University of Arizona Stewart Observatory. And this conference was titled "The Search for Life Beyond the Solar System, Exoplanets, Biosignature, and Instruments." And the stated goal of the conference is to bring together the interdisciplinary community required to address this multifaceted challenge experts on exoplanet observations, early and extreme life on Earth, atmospheric biosignatures, and planet-finding telescopes. So what are they talking about there? Well, one of the things they look for are what they call extremophiles on Earth. And they found, rare forms of life that form near where the Earth has heat ducts in the ocean, so really hot temperatures. Yet they found these extremophiles that are able to live in really hot water. In temperatures we would never expect before. So the existence of these, suggests that maybe a planet like Venus, which is really hot, could host a form of life that we never imagined. So they look at extreme forms of life on Earth, thinking that maybe something similar could be out in space. The other things they're looking for, of course, are these exoplanets, which we've discussed. The atmospheric biosignatures are, they're looking for things that they can detect in atmosphere on a planet way out in space. And they're always developing new ways to try to detect these exoplanets. Now let's look at Mount Graham International Observatory Complex, where the Vatican really maintains its state-of-the-art telescope. This is the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope. It's on top of Mount Graham. It's about an hour and a half outside of Tucson, right next to a little town called Safford, Arizona. And you can actually take a tour. My co-author and I, Tom Horn, actually took a tour of the whole facility. But it's really not a special privilege they granted to just us. Now, I've seen people on the internet that have accused Tom Horn and myself of being in with the Jesuits. Why else would they allow them to go up there and tour the facility? But actually, you can pay a few dollars yourself and take the tour, so you don't have to be a Jesuit. Now, here are me and Tom right in front of the VAT facility. And here is what they call the sub-millimeter telescope. When it's opened up, this is a large radio telescope dish, and they use this for astrobiology as well. It actually searches in what they call the far infrared spectrum, and it can detect biosignatures and things of that nature that you can't see in normal wavelengths of light. This is the Heinrich Hertz sub-millimeter telescope. Now, it's a state-of-the-art single dish radio for observations in the sub-millimeter wavelength. And it's probably one of the most accurate radio telescopes ever built. And in the photo you see here, the sub-millimeter is closed over to the left, and to the right in the distance is the LBT, which is an acronym for the Large Binocular Telescope. Now here are Tom and I walking toward the LBT up that road. It's the largest, most powerful telescope in the world, bar none. It actually gets sharper images than the Hubble Space Telescope. Now here's the LBT at night when it's opened up. This is an $87 million facility. It's the largest, most sophisticated optical telescope on Earth. Now just to give you some contrast, in the 1940s, the Hale telescope at Mount Palomar Observatory in California was considered state-of-the-art. It had a 5.1 meter mirror. Okay? In contrast, the LBT on Mount Graham boasts two 8.4 diameter mirrors for a total collecting area corresponding to a circular mirror with a diameter of 11.8 meters. So it's over twice the size of the Hale. This explains, why the Mount Graham International Observatory can see deeper into space and actually further back into time than any other facility on Earth. And it's also why we suggest that if astrobiologists do discover an Earth-like exoplanet, Mount Graham is probably where it will make it happen. Now, interestingly, how can they see better than the Hubble Space Telescope? Well, part of this binocular design is they have two mirrors, so they can adjust the angle of each mirror and correct for the lensing effect of the Earth's atmosphere. So they can actually correct for that and get a very accurate image, which is part of the binocular design. Now, a main goal, and this is stated on their own website, is to search for Earth-like planets. So it's really not a secret that they're up there hoping to find indications of alien life. Now, this is the thing that has created quite a bit of controversy. The Large Binocular Telescope Near-Infrared Spectroscopic Utility with Camera and Integral Field Unit for Extragalactic Research. Now that long string of words is shoehorned into an acronym, LUCIFER. Now this is quite a stir especially on the internet, and we got some mileage out of it in our book. But when you look into why did they name this instrument Lucifer, it's kind of a mystery. And many people accuse the Jesuits of it, and it turns out that this is actually a consortium of players. An $87 million telescope was financed by a whole host of different people. One of the major players is the Max Planck Institute in Germany. And from what I can tell, they are the ones that are responsible for the satanic illusion. Now, interestingly, when you ask them why they picked the name Lucifer, they kind of give contradictory answers. On one hand, they'll say that, well, in the Bible, in that passage in Isaiah 14 where the term Lucifer appears in the King James Version, that's really not talking about Satan, that's talking about the king of Babylon. So out of one side of their mouth, these guys will deny that it's talking about the devil. Yet, as it turns out, the German politician whose last name is Teufel. Now, interestingly, in German, the word Teufel means devil. So this would be the equivalent of a U.S. senator named Senator Devil. And that really is his name in German. Now, he's the one who obtained the funding for the Max Planck Institute to get involved in the Large Binocular Telescope project. So in order to honor him, they thought that they would name this instrument Lucifer. So, on one hand, they're denying that it has anything to do with the devil, but yet on the other side of their mouth, they're saying, well, yeah, we wanted to honor Mr. Devil by calling it Lucifer. So it really does seem that they did name it after the devil one way or the other. Now, what do they use this thing for? What is the Lucifer instrument? Well, it's really basically a very powerful infrared camera that sees in infrared spectrum. And they use it for what they call spectroscopy. Now, spectroscopy pertains to looking at light to determine what chemical elements are in it. And they can detect this by the wavelengths of the light and the way it reflects. Now, chemists do this all the time on Earth. But by using a really high-powered infrared camera that gathers light from these large mirrors, they can look at the physical properties of what's reflecting off the planet and determine what chemical elements might be in it. So this is one of the ways that they look for signs of life. They look for the presence of liquid water, carbon and oxygen, things that would go along with organic chemistry. So infrared spectroscopy deals in this infrared region, and this is actually light that can actually get here a lot better than regular wavelength light. It's easier for it to cross the traverse of space. It has that longer wavelength and a lower frequency. So by doing that, they are looking for organic compounds and signs of life. So Lucifer really is a key instrument in the search for life in space. Now, interestingly, some famous people have weighed in about what the Vatican is doing up on Mount Graham. And here's astronaut Gordon Cooper, who once said, "You want to know about UFOs and little green men? Contact the Vatican. They have an observatory out in Arizona, and that's what they're looking for." So here's another very interesting quote. Former Jesuit Catholic theologian Father Malachi Martin, who before his death in 1999 hinted at something like imminent extraterrestrial disclosure. Now, while he was on Coast to Coast AM radio in 1997, Art Bell asked Malachi why the Vatican was heavily invested in the study of deep space at the Mount Graham Observatory. His answer was quite suggestive. He said, quote, "Because the mentality among those who are at the highest levels of Vatican administration and geopolitics know that what's going on in space and what's approaching us could be of great import in the next 5 to 10 years. Now, of course, that decade has gone by since then. But what is it that he thought was approaching us? That's very suggestive. Now, some suggestions that I've thought of, in Catholic eschatology, they kind of have an idea that a great comet is going to appear before the end times. So many of us have thought perhaps he was making an allusion to the great comet. Maybe they were watching for that. Other things would be in the book of Revelation, we read about wormwood, which sounds like an asteroid or something like that hits the Earth, a huge falling star that poisons the oceans and wipes out a large portion of life. Maybe they're looking for that. But in the context of the conversation with Art Bell that night, it wouldn't be much of a stretch to think that maybe they were looking for the arrival of aliens. I mean, that's another possibility. Malachi didn't tell us, and he kind of left this vague statement of what's approaching us. So he seemed to suggest that the Vatican really has a mission up there to be watching for something that's coming this way. Now, the director of the VORG, George Coignet, said in an interview when the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope went online in 1993 that NASA's job would be to monitor for alien communication. He said the Vatican was going to search for planets displaying conditions for life, and should intelligent life be found, he said that the Church was obliged to address the question of whether extraterrestrials might be brought within the fold and baptized. And this was the first statement I can find of a high-ranking Vatican official mentioning the baptism of extraterrestrials. Now, as of the time of recording this video, Pope Francis announced just last week that he would baptize an extraterrestrial. He even mentioned Martians. And so that's unprecedented. You'll see that we have many of these Jesuit members of the Vatican Observatory Research Group have made public statements about baptism of extraterrestrials. The first was George Coignet back in 93 that I mentioned. In a New York Times article titled, "Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial?" another VORG astronomer, Cris Putnam, indicated that he would baptize an extraterrestrial. And similarly, on the slide here, you see Guy Consolmagno, and he replied, well, only if they ask, and then qualified, any entity, no matter how many tentacles it has a soul. Now, this is interesting in light of Catholic theology, because Catholic theology holds that baptism in and of itself removes the guilt of original sin. Not faith in the gospel, but rather the ritual itself takes away sin. Now, this is something that Protestants have always opposed because it really doesn't have any kind of faith component to it necessarily. This is why they can sprinkle some water on a baby's head and assume that it's now within the Catholic Church. I don't think that anything magic happens when you sprinkle some water on a baby's head. I don't believe that removes your sin. I think that that comes only through faith in the gospel. It really is something that you have to believe, and you have to repent, and you really have to acknowledge God. I don't think that there's any magical formula, but if you can imagine, if you really believe that this ritual itself was capable of making someone guilt-free in front of God, then if they were to baptize an alien, would they assume that it was now in God's favor? Now, wouldn't that leave them wide open to some sort of deceptive entity that was lying to them? It seems to be so. And the thing that's very interesting about these developments is right now, Guy Consolmagno, who's the one on the screen there, he's out giving lectures. He just gave the commencement address at a major university talking about baptizing ETs. He gave an address in the UK about 2 weeks ago about baptizing ETs at another university. And Pope Francis just last week brought it up within one of his homilies. Kind of tongue-in-cheek, and the media played it off as he was jesting. But it makes you wonder, are they just kind of softening people up to this idea because they've been saying it so many times through so many different sources, since 1993. It really does suggest a lot of interesting possibilities. But they seem really enamored with the idea of baptizing extraterrestrials. Now, this all goes back really into the 90s when Monsignor Corrado Balducci, an exorcist theologian, member of the Vatican Curia, the governing body in Rome, he was a friend of Pope John Paul II. Now, he appeared on Italian television in 1995 and made some really startling assertions. And they really prompted a firestorm of speculation in ufology. Now, in this video that you're about to see, he claims that the existence of alien life is something that is pretty much a proven entity. He said there's really no way you can doubt it given the evidence he's aware of. So we'll watch this clip.
Padre Balducci, allora, lei che cosa risponderebbe a quanti sostengono che gli alieni sono già fra di noi?
Non si può più pensare è vero, non è vero, sono veri o sono falsità, ci si crede o non ci si crede, no. Oramai ci sono varie considerazioni che fanno dire con certezza che l'esistenza di questi esseri c'è. Non si può dubitare. Magari si potrà dire che su 100 fenomeni ce ne saranno anche se si dicesse 99 non vero e 1 vero, c'è quell'uno che dice che certi fenomeni esistono. Quindi questo è il primo problema, non rientra più nell'ambito della prudenza umana, dubitare, perché la prudenza dice di essere prudenti, ma non di negare.
Con quali conseguenze sotto il profilo della religione, della filosofia?
Non c'è alcuna conseguenza negativa, tutto è contemplato, mica il Signore ci ha rivelato tutto. E quindi si può pensare benissimo, anche alla stessa redenzione umana, Cristo rimane sempre il centro dell'universo, ma nell'universo c'è tutto, non solo il mondo, ma ci sono le migliaia di stelle, le migliaia di galassie e ci sono, non voglio adesso dire i numeri, ma indubbiamente si può pensare e ragionevolmente a questo punto, ed entriamo qui nella seconda questione, come si spiegano, alla esistenza di altri mondi abitati. In che maniera abitati? Da chi abitati? Vede, c'è un detto che risale ancora a secoli fa, natura non facit saltus, la natura non fa salti, cioè c'è il regno vegetale, il regno animale e il regno umano e il regno angelico, le uniche cose, 4 regni che conosciamo. 3 sono naturali e li vediamo. Tra l'uomo, l'essere umano e l'angelo c'è un salto un po' grosso da fare. Ecco perché già con questo argomento della convenienza, che è illustrato molto bene da San Tommaso, uno dei più grandi teologi, è probabile, è verosimile, ecco, più che altro, che tra l'uomo, che ha già uno spirito in sé, ma povero spirito, è soggetto alla materia in una maniera incredibile, basta alla sera uno sente il bisogno di andare a letto, mentre l'anima non ha bisogno di dormire, basta una piccola malattia, insomma, è talmente imprigionato. E l'angelo, che è solo spirito, è verosimile che ci siano altri esseri i quali abbiano un'anima, diciamo così, che è meno legata, meno subordinata al corpo, e un'anima di questo genere è ovvio che può compiere progressi che noi, per quanto ne facciamo tanti in questi ultimi decenni, non saremo in grado.
So what are we to make from such a highly placed insider saying there are several considerations that allow us to say with assurance that the existence of these beings is real? I mean, the title Monsignor indicates that he's received a special honor for the Pope, so it'd be difficult to argue that he's some sort of loose cannon. He was also the official exorcist and demonologist for Rome. So we have a really respected, supposed expert in demonology saying that you can't doubt the existence of extraterrestrials from the evidence that he's aware of. Now here he is again. This is just a screenshot from a recent film called Sirius by Stephen Greer. It featured Balducci in an interview, and you can see the caption. He's saying that the ETs are far superior to us. While it's neglected by most skeptical sciences, the UFO phenomenon, particularly the abduction and contactee reports, have led credible experts to conclude that deceptive entities are posing as space aliens. Now, I believe these entities play a pivotal role in the end-time deception predicted in Scripture. Now, interestingly, Lieutenant Colonel Nelson Pacheco of the United States Air Force, he said this, quote, "The 5% or so of UFO reports that are not misrepresentations, delusions, or hoaxes are real in the sense of being intelligent but peripheral psychophysical intrusions into our experiential universe by metaphysical intelligent entities that exist outside our space-time continuum, what some may call a parallel universe." Now, as I was reading ufologist Richard Dolan's newest book, UFOs for the 21st Century of Mind, a few sentences stood out. Quote, "Not only is the apparent UFO technology well beyond contemporary human abilities, but whatever motivates their operators remains a mystery. They simply refuse to make sense to us," end quote. Now, according to Dolan, a core feature of the phenomenon is a, quote, "reliable people reporting events that smack of the absurd," end quote. Now, this was addressed by Jacques Vallée in the 1970s. Now, something that he called metalogic. Another quote from Richard Dolan's newest book is, quote, "After all these years, we still don't know who precisely is operating these objects. We may have ideas, but in fact we don't know. More puzzling still is the logic of their behavior. Why buzz our aircraft? Why play cat and mouse games? Why the bizarre apparent interactions with people around the world? What we're dealing with, an unknown phenomenon that behaves inexplicably and apparently does not want to reveal itself to us." Now, Jacques Vallée in the Invisible College in 1975 introduced the hypothesis that UFOs are a component working in a control system meant to influence and steer human culture. Now, Vallée realized that the control system is analogous to a thermostat that controls room temperature. When the room gets too hot, the air conditioning is triggered. When it gets too cold, the heat activates. Now, in this way, he asserts that UFOs are a component in a control system influencing human consciousness and beliefs. Now, this not only explains why they seem evasive and deceptive, it clarifies why the phenomenon appears to be deliberately promoting a level of absurdity that evades rational scrutiny. Because most people dismiss this subject as nonsense. This is what Vallée calls metalogic. In his book Dimensions, Vallée described this metalogic in this way, quote, "If you wanted to bypass the intelligentsia, the church, remain undetectable to the military system, leave undisturbed the political and administrative levels of a society, and at the same time implant deep within the society far-reaching doubts concerning its basic philosophical tenets, this is exactly how you would have to act." Now think about that. What he's saying is that the UFO phenomenon kind of promotes absurdities on purpose, so it flies under the radar of the academics and the military. They all brush it off as nonsense, as crazy people. And this is sort of a camouflage. You know, meanwhile, they're interacting with people, they're doing all these things, yet none of the people in charge or in power are really paying attention because they just assume it's all nonsense. Now, Vallée continues, at the same time, of course, such a process would have to provide its own explanation to make ultimate detection impossible. In other words, it would have to project an image just beyond the belief structure of the target society. It would have to disturb and reassure at the same time, exploiting both the gullibility of the zealots and the narrow-mindedness of the debunkers. Now, this is exactly what the UFO phenomenon does. Another scholar, Keith Thompson, observed, quote, "Without our notice, the human mythological structure has been undergoing a fundamental shift. Public opinion surveys and other measures of collective pulse reveal that more people than ever now take it for granted that we are not alone in the universe, inner as well as outer universes, if such a division is finally possible. Without ever landing on the White House lawn, the phenomenon is profoundly altering culture. Roughly half the American population believes in ETs. So in a sense, the ETs are already here. For such a fringe phenomenon, it has a disproportionately prevalent influence." Now, in the UK, there was a poll done that said 33 million people believe in ETs compared to only 27 million who believe in God. So here we have a headline, "More believe in space aliens than God," according to UK survey. Now, in the USA, a recent report by National Geographic indicated that only 36% of Americans, which is still 80 million people, believe ETs exist. A 2008 survey conducted by the Scripps Howard News Service at Ohio University, they found that 1/3 of adults believe it is either very likely or somewhat likely that intelligent extraterrestrials had visited Earth. But even more, 56% say it is either very likely or somewhat likely that intelligent life exists on other planets. 1 in 12 said that he or she had personally seen a UFO that might have been an alien spaceship. The study also reported that people who had recently attended church and who personally identified as born again are less likely to believe in UFOs or the existence of ETs. But what do we make of more people believe in ET than God in the United Kingdom? You know, I think you could make an effective argument that the strong delusion is already here. Now, in the 1950s, the famous Swiss psychiatrist and founder of analytical psychology, Carl Gustav Jung, he spoke of the UFO phenomenon as a modern myth in the making. Now, he concluded that, quote, UFOs could be easily conceived of as gods, end quote. Accordingly, he noted that they often take on messianic qualities, and he saw that this UFO mythos was filling the gap left by the waning Christian consensus in Europe. Now, speaking to secularization, he wrote, quote, the dominating idea of a mediator and God who became man, after having thrust the old polytheistic beliefs into the background, is now, in turn, on the point of evaporating. He's talking about Christianity. Untold millions of so-called Christians have lost their belief in a real and living mediator. So he argued that secularized man projects his deep psychological need for a savior onto the ET. You know, it's kind of a scientifically respectable way of worshiping a transcendent being. Ted Peters, who is a professor of systematic theology at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, he characterizes this alien savior mythos, writing, quote, with the constant threat of thermonuclear destruction in post-World War II era, leaving our planet in a state of insecurity and anxiety, it is no wonder that many have begun to hope for a Messiah to save us. The holiness of the sky and the need for salvation converge and blend when the bright, clean, powerful UFO zooms up on the horizon. Could it be our celestial savior, end quote. So Ted Peters has noted that this popular UFO belief and things like ancient astronaut theory, they offer an ostensibly respectable way of talking about our deeper religious needs. You know, in other words, these ET beliefs put a scientific gloss on the secularist, inescapable but personally embarrassing religious sensibilities. Now, C.S. Lewis wrote in an essay called Religion and Rocketry, which was a response to the physicist Fred Hoyle, who was criticizing Christianity. I think it is really interesting that Lewis saw this alien thing as potentially counter-evidence that would be presented against the Christian faith. And here's a quote from that essay where he said, "We have been warned that all but conclusive evidence against Christianity, evidence that would deceive, if it were possible, the very elect, will appear with the Antichrist. And after that, there will be wholly conclusive evidence on the other side, but not, I fancy, until then on either side." So what he's saying is there'll be some counter-evidence presented against Christianity. Perhaps these aliens will show up. Hey, we created you. We seeded life on Earth, this panspermia idea. Already scientifically respectable. Everyone's primed to believe it, right? So really compelling counter-evidence against the Christian faith, against the Bible. Now what he's saying, though, is that we won't know one way or the other which one is true until the other side, until it's resolved. You know, and what would resolve that? Well, Christians' great hope would be the return of Christ. Now, if he returns and destroys this belief, then we know we were right. If it turns out that the aliens were right, then everyone will be aware of that on the other side. But so what Lewis is saying is that society might get faced with really compelling evidence against Christianity, and no one's going to know the truth until it's resolved. And he saw that coming, way back. Now, he was referring to the words in Matthew's gospel that said that this deception would be so compelling it could deceive even the elect, meaning born-again Christians. So Jesus said, then if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there he is, don't believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Now here we come back to another, Richard Dolan, one of the most respected ufologists out there. He's not a Christian. Richard is a nice guy. I've kind of texted back and forth with him some on some of these issues, and he's the kind of person he's a good researcher, and he's open to exploring the evidence. And I hope that we might put a stone in his shoe, and he might consider our worldview. Now, Dolan is actually commenting on the claim that Jesus Christ is an extraterrestrial. Now, believe it or not, many of the alien contactees and people who claim to have, communication with these aliens come back with this message that Jesus was an extraterrestrial and that we just misunderstood. So here's Dolan, kind of commenting on that idea. He says, quote, even if aliens were to announce themselves tomorrow and make such a claim, people would still have to decide whether or not to believe them. They could be lying after all. Ultimately, arriving at a sound answer to such matters and understanding our long-term relationship to these other beings may turn out to be impossible, end quote. Now I find that very intellectually honest for somebody coming from a secular position, so I just wanted to applaud Mr. Dolan on that. Now here we have a Roman Catholic theologian from the Opus Dei order, Thomas O'Mara, suggesting that there have been other incarnations other than Jesus of Nazareth. And he says, can there not be other incarnations? The power of a divine person is infinite and cannot be limited to anything created. Could the Word of God incarnate in creatures other than Jesus of Nazareth? Question mark. So the way that they kind of undermine biblical doctrine and sort of have an escape clause is, to put a question mark at the end of it. This is kind of a technique that a lot of people will use so they don't really have to take responsibility for what they're actually arguing. And that's what O'Mara is doing here. He's actually suggesting that they're alien saviors on other worlds. Here is Chris Corbley, one of the Jesuit astronomers from the Vatican Observatory Research Group. Now, he's written very clearly here, quote, while Christ is the first and the last word, the Alpha and Omega spoken to humanity, he is not necessarily the only word spoken to the universe. For the word spoken to us does not seem to exclude an equivalent word spoken to aliens, end quote. So here we have a Jesuit astronomer suggesting that maybe Christ isn't sufficient. We need other alien saviors. Here's Brother Guy Consolmagno. Any alien we find will learn and change from contact with us, just as we will learn and change from contact with them. It's inevitable. And they'll be evangelizing us too. Now, isn't that interesting? This is why Protestants have a problem with the Jesuits suggesting other incarnations on alien worlds and these sort of ideas that we've just seen come from these Catholics. The New Testament, the book of Colossians, chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, for in him, speaking of Jesus Christ, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of the cross. So the claim of the New Testament is that the cross is really the pivotal event in cosmic history, not just earth history, whether heaven or earth. So where these Catholics get this idea that these other incarnations and other saviors are necessary is really an abiblical, it's really opposed to Christian theology. Now, since our book EXO-VATICANA was released, we've received some pushback from the Vorg, specifically Brother Guy Consolmagno. Now, here's some statements that he made on his blog. There are no Vatican secrets about UFOs. Neither I nor anyone I know has any evidence that extraterrestrials exist. We do not believe that Jesus is a hybrid or any of these other bizarre claims that this author makes. So he was responding to some of the things that I wrote and some things Tom Horn, my co-author, wrote. But what we see in his statement here is that we have three claims. One, that there are no Vatican UFO secrets. Two, that he's not aware of any evidence that ETs exist and there's not any of that evidence. And three, that the Vatican, none of these guys believe that Jesus was a hybrid. So let's examine his three claims that he's making against us and his response. The first one, no UFO secrets. Now, this is a clip from the extraterrestrial disclosure hearings in Washington, D.C. Now, in this clip, Daniel Sheehan, an attorney with degrees from Harvard in government, law, and divinity, who had served on legal counsel for the Jesuit order. He also was in a lot of famous court cases, the Karen Silkwood case, Iran-Contra, 3 Mile Island, Watergate, and he was asked to get the UFO files from the Vatican Library when he was lead counsel for the Jesuit order. So if anybody should have been given access to them, you would think it would have been Sheehan. And he was general counsel for the Jesuit headquarters in Washington, D.C., and this request was made by President Jimmy Carter. So in this clip, you'll hear him explain.
Carter asked to be briefed by the Director of Central Intelligence on the issue of UFOs. And in that meeting, CIA Director Bush asked the President-elect if the President-elect would leave him in as the Central Intelligence Agency Director. And that he would promise that he would never run for political office in his life if Carter would agree to keep him in as the Director of the CIA. Bush wanted to, at that time, become more or less like J. Edgar Hoover had become at the FBI, that he would remain, that it would be above politics, that he would remain in that position. President Carter reiterated his request for the UFO information, saying that he had his own person in mind to be the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, which happened to be Teddy Sorensen at the time. Bush at that time then refused to provide the information to him, saying that he did not have adequate clearances, he was not the president yet, and that he should ask his own Central Intelligence Agency director for that. But if he wanted to have the information ahead of time, that what he could do is he could contact the Science and Technology Committee of the House of Representatives, and that they had an ongoing relationship with the Science and Technology Division of the Congressional Research Service that could go about getting things declassified to show him. That is what generated the request from the Congressional Research Service to me as the General Counsel for the Jesuit headquarters in the United States, asking if I could gain access to the Vatican Library to obtain the information that the Vatican has in its library, in its classified sections, to deliver to the President for his review. I did that. I contacted the Jesuit, who happens to be the head of the Vatican Library, requesting this information, and much to my surprise, I was denied information. I wrote a second letter to them saying, look, I guess you must not know who we are here. This is the Jesuit headquarters in the United States. We have 10 provinces here in the United States, more than any other country in the world, and we're requesting this information to share with the President. They still declined.
So we see that Sheehan's request was rejected by the Vatican. Kind of an astounding claim if there are no Vatican UFO secrets, as Consolmagno claims. Now, as we seen earlier, the Vatican has a special group that goes around investigating apparitions and things like Fatima. So the oldest running bureaucracy in history, going back into the Middle Ages, that there are going to be records of all sorts of anomalous things in the sky that they've written about and investigated. So for him to claim there are no Vatican UFO secrets, I think is obviously false. He said that the next claim is that there's no evidence for extraterrestrials. But earlier we saw the clip of Monsignor Balducci announcing on television that nowadays there are several considerations that allow us to say with assurance that the existence of these beings is real. We cannot have doubts. So here we have a high-ranking, Monsignor, friend of Pope John Paul II, saying that we can't even have doubts that ETs exist. So that seems quite in disagreement with Consolmagno's claim that there's no evidence of ETs. Now obviously, he's not telling us the whole story. The third claim is that we do not believe Jesus was a hybrid, or any of these other bizarre claims this author makes. So where would Tom Horn and I get the idea that Consolmagno would think something like that? Well, in his own book, he actually made allusion to Genesis 6 with the Nephilim. And Genesis 6:4 says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward when the sons of God, these are divine beings, heavenly beings, the word is Benai Elohim, beings from the spirit realm, came to the daughters of men and bore children by them. So these are actually hybrid beings that are the giants that appear later in the Old Testament. Now, of course, the Nephilim are these hybrid offspring. So these are hybrids by definition. In Consolmagno's book, he says, but whether you interpret these creatures, Nephilim, as angels or aliens doesn't really matter. For the sake of our argument here, the point is that the ancient writers of the Bible, like all ancient peoples, were perfectly happy with the possibility that other intelligent beings could exist. So he actually is claiming, that these Nephilim are equivalent to the belief in aliens. Now, Here's a claim where I think you could easily extrapolate this idea of a hybrid Christ. Here he's clearly suggesting that Jesus not only died for aliens, but perhaps for the child. He's a child of other races. Now, this is right from his own hand, his book, Intelligent Life in the Universe. And it's really interesting that it's almost impossible to find this book anywhere. If you try to go on Amazon or any used book source, it appears that someone went out and bought up every copy possibly imaginable, and they've all disappeared. In fact, we had to go to exorbitant lengths to get a copy of this book. But here's a quote from Consolmagno. Perhaps it's not so far-fetched to see the second person of the Trinity, the Word, who was present in the beginning, coming to lay his life down and take it up again, not only as the Son of Man, but also as a child of other races. Now, a child of other races, wouldn't that make him some sort of hybrid? I think so. So it seems to me that all three of Consolmagno's counterclaims are false, and provably false. And his defense, is just woefully inadequate, and it suggests something of an obfuscation of the truth. Now, the alien abduction phenomenon is one of the more troubling aspects of UFOs and the claims to alien contact. In 1987, a book called Communion came out, and it was a bestseller by Whitley Strieber. And it's really his experiences with these non-human entities. And it was made into a film. Now, as a counter-reply, a Christian book came out later called Unholy Communion. And it really argues the hypothesis that what we're dealing with here are not space aliens, but probably something equivalent to these sons of God mentioned in Genesis 6, fallen angels who are interacting with human beings. Now, it's really interesting when you read the writings of some of these abductees. They're coming from a secular perspective that many of them seem to waffle in their interpretation of what's going on. The Pulitzer Prize-winning Harvard psychiatrist, Dr. John Mack, he was a serious academic, who really risked his reputation and his career to investigate the alien abduction phenomenon. Now, he counseled probably over 100 abductees, and in the course of doing that, he detected a remarkable coherence in their accounts. Now, intriguingly, he determined that abduction was something more than simple nuts and bolts ET technology visiting Earth, but something of the spirit realm. Now, in this quote, in the sequel to the book Communion, Whitley Strieber seems to be completely convinced that these were demons. UFO researchers realize that abductions do not make sense from a scientific point of view. This is Jacques Vallée, probably one of the more qualified ufologists, and he says, quote, "The medical examination to which abductees are said to be subjected, often accompanied by sadistic sexual manipulation, is reminiscent of medieval tales of encounters with demons. It makes no sense in a sophisticated or technical framework. Any intelligent being equipped with the scientific marvels that UFOs possess would be in a position to achieve any of these alleged scientific objectives in shorter time with fewer risks." Now think about it. Why would super intelligent, highly technologically evolved beings have to come down and abduct humans and take biological samples from them and whatnot? Any of those kinds of samples they wanted, they could actually get in mass quantities by teleporting them out of a hospital or something of that nature. There's simply no need to go around abducting different individuals to do scientific work. It really doesn't make any sort of sense, other than that's just sort of a cover story for really just statistically manipulating humans, something they seem to enjoy doing. Now here we go with Dr. John Mack again. And this is one of those quotes that is really kind of chilling. He says, "Some abductees feel that certain beings seem to want to take their souls from them. Now, Greg told me that the terror of his encounter with a certain reptilian being was so intense that he feared being separated from his soul." Now, why would an abductee come to that conclusion if these are aliens doing science? Now, here's some solutions to organizations that are operated by by Christians. Chris White is behind www.stopsleepparalysis.org. Now, what gets labeled sleep paralysis is actually a whole range of phenomenon. So if you're someone who has experienced something like alien abduction, don't let that title get in your way, because we've determined that a lot of these phenomena are the same thing, but they get labeled as different things because the beings that are actually perpetrating them will use different cover stories for what's going on. Some people it's aliens, some people it's spectrophilia, or even sex with ghosts, which is something that's actually becoming quite popular in the media in the last few weeks before I do this presentation. And then another website with a wealth of information arguing the basic hypothesis that these are demonic fallen angel beings is alienresistance.org. And look in the subheadings of that one for the CE4, Close Encounters 4 Research Group. Both of those organizations can provide a host of services to someone who has experienced this. Now, what do evangelicals think in general? Well, here's a respectable academic, Dr. Timothy Daly of the Family Research Council, and he wrote a book called The Millennial Deception. And here's a quote. "We are witnessing a masterful satanic subterfuge that appears to involve the appearance of angels and aliens. Many are asking whether the coming of Antichrist can be far removed." Now, why would Dr. Daly think such a thing? Well, the Bible predicts an unparalleled demonic deception prior to Christ's return. If over half the church no longer believes in demons, then they're ripe for deception. So how much more for the secular world? And on this slide, you just see several of the verses. We mentioned before that Jesus warned that it could lead astray even the elect if that were possible. In 2 Thessalonians, Paul talks about the activity of Satan with all power, signs and wonders, with all wicked deception. He says God sends them a strong delusion because they refuse to believe. And in the book of Revelation, chapter 12 depicts a war in heaven. And the result of that is Michael and the archangels, they have victory over Satan, and he's cast to earth. And it says Satan, the deceiver of the whole world, he was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Now, might that be viewed by the secular world as some sort of alien landing? I don't know, but it would provide a plausible explanation. The book of Revelation also depicts a world leader who will be worshipped. Now, with all the diversity in the world, how can we imagine an entire world worshiping a man who makes just a bizarre claim to be God? The book of Revelation says all authority will be given to him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. All who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life. So, unbelievers are going to fall for this lock, stock, and barrel and worship a man who claims to be God. It's really hard to imagine what would be so compelling that would draw them in to believe that story. Well, the big idea is that belief in a superior extraterrestrial being uniquely provides a credible basis for everyone, from secular scientists like Richard Dawkins, across the whole spectrum of religious beliefs, to accept and worship an individual who claims deity. The idea is for something to capture the attention of the whole world, all these people with different perspectives, whatever it is would have to be transcendent of the world, something out of this world, something that they would all look up and see and have to acknowledge. Now, interestingly, that's not an original idea of mine. Ronald Reagan expressed several times some interesting thoughts what would unite the world very quickly.
We often forget how much unites all the members of humanity. Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
So as we can see, it provides a very compelling solution to the problem of why the whole world might worship the Antichrist. Now, I'm not saying that I know that that's the way it's going to go down, But it's hard to imagine, a more plausible scenario when you see all the media, that we've been exposed to since the 1940s revolving flying saucers and aliens and science fiction. It really seems to me that a lot of groundwork has been invested. Hollywood has pumped out a steady stream of alien-themed movies, and most of the world already is really primed to accept this. Now, if we really do believe that there's a supernatural enemy behind human culture that's seeking to deceive people, as the book, in 2 Corinthians 4:4, Paul says the God of this world, meaning Satan, has blinded the minds of unbelievers. Now, might he use the media to do that? Of course he does. And popular media has really put this idea of aliens into our culture in such a compelling way. By accepting that, go back and think of those assumptions I listed in astrobiology. When you start accepting that, you go up the list, the Earth's not special, humans are not special, life pops into being from non-life. That host of assumptions comes along with the idea that life is teeming in the universe by naturalistic processes. So for that reason, I think that this is something that we really should be paying attention to, something that you should be aware of, and it's likely that this is the area that's going to deceive the world in some form or another. Now, I think that naturalism, this idea that everything is explainable by science, is waning. We're seeing, a huge movement in our culture. We have, ghost shows on TV. A couple decades ago, it would be unthinkable to have dozens of reality programs with people hunting for spirits. It's common today. So we're in what I call a paranormal paradigm shift. And I just released a new book called The Supernatural Worldview that just came out this week as the time I'm recording this video. But I help you to parse many of these new paranormal events and a lot of the evidence coming from parapsychology and related fields through a Christian lens. I think that we have to be prepared for an unprecedented level of paranormal and supernatural phenomenon that are going to be manifesting as the Christian consensus in our culture wanes. We're going to see an increase in demonic phenomenon and all sorts of bizarre supernatural things. So I just want the church to be ready for that, and I hope that you'll check out my new book, The Supernatural Worldview, which will help you parse this new information. Thank you very much.